sounds good.
Is that on?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to start while people are trickling in, and I'm going to start introducing bachelor's at Indiana University, his bachelor's in forestry at Purdue, and he worked for the Forest Service for a while in between those. And so it comes from a strong temperate forestry background. Post-PhD, I recruited Dan to the tropical side, and he came and he worked with me for a few years as a postdoc. He was my first postdoc way back when. And he has also, after that, he went on to do some other postdocs, including, I'm looking at this one, Los Alamos National Lab, doing a lot of large-scale tree mortality analyses on data sets from around the world, and then started as faculty at University of Florida, where he is in the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences, which is an interesting combination that I'm sure has a long
It has a great history.
Yeah. And recently got tenure there and is currently on sabbatical as a Bullard Fellow at Harvard Forest. So he's just up the road for a little while longer. If people want to bug him more, I'm sure he'd be happy. And for me, it's a great pleasure to have Dan here, get to catch up, get to hear what he's been working on. And I'm sure you'll all be excited to hear about his research on the role of neighbors, identity and condition in tree demography.
Thank you, Liza. Yep, I'm on it. All right, thank you. This is a pleasure to be here. I was a Yale postdoc for a year, way back when, but this is a lovely chance to come up and visit. I have been at Harvard Forest for 6 months now, so I feel like I'm your neighbor. And won't you be my neighbor? I'm going to invite you today to join me in this room and talk about what it is to be a neighbor and what that might mean. And for humans, that's you can think about your neighborhood and you might think about something like this, depending on where you live in the world. And you have the ability as a human to think about the scale of your neighborhood and who you include in that neighborhood. It might be just the person next door. Maybe you don't even know your neighbors. But it's a matter of scale, right? So somebody in a rural area might have a different concept of what neighbors are versus somebody in an urban area. But at a certain scale, we're all neighbors. We can't escape each other on this. Well, some are trying to escape us, but pretty much we're stuck here. But we have the ability to move around this great planet we live on. Plants, on the other hand, don't have that ability. And that's what I think about is plants and trees really specifically. And so the fact that trees are strapped to the ground, not really going anywhere, creates a situation where we can think about the outcomes of your life as a tree through this lens of who are your neighbors? Well, does that matter? So that's what I'm going to talk a lot about today, and that's what a lot of my research is focused on. So what's a neighborhood to a tree? It's usually a collection of those individuals, and this is how I'm going to work with it throughout the talk today, is a collection of individuals that are at the same taxonomic level, that they interact, that they're within some distance of each other. They're relatively short distances away from each other, and how that might influence the outcomes of basic plant interactions. And because trees and plants kind of share the same basic requirements, this creates a situation where we can expect that who your neighbors are going to matter, right? So trees and plants in general need 3 basic things: light, water, nutrients at some level. And so that sets up a situation where they're all competing for similar resources, and so your space matters. And in a forest, it's really about spatial packing, and in an agricultural setting, how many individuals can you pack into an area? This has been studied and quantified in a number of ways. This has a long history, especially in forestry research. So early on, it was recognized by Reineke all the way back in the early 30s that you could create a relationship between diameter, so the size of individuals, and the number. So on the y-axis, we got the number of individuals and the average diameter. And Reineke came up with this idea of stand density index to describe the maximum density that a species could withstand. And this works really well when you talk about even age, so all the plants are the same age, and at field experiments with different plant species and looked at the packing that happens. And so same idea here, the number of plants versus the weight, the size, the density of plants in terms of biomass. And not only did Yoda look at the number versus size, but he also plotted them through time. And you can see that plants will come up to this carrying capacity line. You can't pack more than that based on the structure of the individuals. And I'm going to show you an example of this playing out through time in southern pine plantations. So these are 3 different pine plantation studies in the southeastern US. And each dot is representing a treatment of that. And you can see through time, coming up to age 16, this is loblolly slash pine. As they grow, they start to gain size, which is on your y-axis, and then they start to lose individuals as they get bigger. So they hit this self-thinning line. This spatial packing is at the root of understanding neighborhoods. Most of these we're looking at operate at a stand scale, at a large area, but what about local neighborhoods? Is there a packing that exists, or that space of your local trees, that influences your ability to grow, survive, and reproduce? How do we go about quantifying these things? Traditionally, we've used this focal tree approach, where we have an individual that's our focal tree, and we have some defined distance away from that tree, where we have neighbors, and we go out and we measure the distance between the focal tree and the neighbors, and we measure the size of the neighbors, and then we can quantify this into a neighborhood competition index. A lot of this work came from Charlie Canham and company back in the early 2000s. He tested a series of variations in neighborhood functional forms to see how we could best quantify the neighborhood competition index. And so typically we take the diameter, DBH, diameter breast height, over the distance. So it's a distance-weighted size. DBH is raised to some power that's fit, and distance is raised to some power that's fit. And then this lambda here controls the functional form. Canham took this neighborhood competition index and applied it to FIA data, the Forest Inventory and Analysis data for the US, and found as this neighborhood competition index increases, the relative growth rate of individuals decreases, right? So he's quantifying the competitive effect of having more neighbors. These are for just trees over 60 centimeters, and if you don't think in centimeters, that's about this big. It's a pretty big tree. So these are large trees having negative influences of having a neighbor or more neighbors in the area. This pattern holds out and is stronger for the smaller trees, but even at large adult trees that we would think of as in the canopy of the forest, they're still suffering from having a greater neighborhood density around them. So we've been looking at this sort of influences of neighborhoods on demography for decades now. I'm going to talk a bit about how it might reflect on reproduction and recruitment, as well as growth and survival, those elements of demography. Theoretically, neighborhoods could have a series of effects, right? So we could have positive effects. I talked about a negative effect there with the Canham example, but In more arid conditions, we get facilitation through habitat amelioration, changing the landscape, changing the microenvironment. The herd effect is another positive effect where having greater numbers of individuals around you might make you more or less apparent to other species that might want to eat you. So there are neutral effects where there's just seemingly you have no interactions with your neighbors. And then we could have negative effects, right, through the basic competition, but also through natural enemies. And I'm going to talk about some examples from my work in my lab over the last few years that have looked at these different interactions. So I've got 3 acts for you today. I have a tale of pine and oak. I have a tale of observation of patterns and species coexistence, and then I'm going to finish off today with a ghost story for you. So let's jump into this. I'm going to utilize the Forest Geo Network for a lot of this research, pretty much all of it. This is a Smithsonian Institution umbrella network of research plots where we map, measure, and identify everything larger than a centimeter in diameter across a large area of the landscape. We're talking 25 to 50 hectares, which translates to like 60 to 120 acres of forest where we know every individual species, diameter, and condition through time. For the first act, I'm going to talk about the tale of Quercus and Pinus, or oak and pine. And I'm going to focus in on the Ordway-Swisher plot. This is a plot that I established at the Ordway-Swisher Biological Research Station in Florida. This is a simple system. It is 2 species, pretty much exclusively, or vast majority are pine species, Pinus palustris, the longleaf pine, and an oak species. I included this picture because I wanted to show you that we do get fall colors in Florida. This picture was taken in the middle of December, so by then you will all have lost all your leaves, but we're reveling in the glory of turkey oak at that time. So this plot, what does it look like? This is a stem map of the plot. The pine are in orange, the oak are in blue, and every other individual of the other species are in black. It's 23 hectares. I have about 10,000 stems that are mapped out there, and they're from 10 different species. But those 2 species, Pinus palustris and Quercus laevis, make up 96% of the basal area and number of individuals in the plot. So we really have a 2-species system. So I have something very simple to look at. How do these species interact? While we were installing the plot in 2019, Jackie and Joey here, Jackie's on the left, Joey's on the right, they coined this term. They're like, oh, we've got another Quercus pinus. Oh, we got another Quercus pinus. We were finding an oak tree that was of decent size, and then there would be a pine right next to it, really close to it. So much so that they coined a term. You can see it in this picture. Next to Joey there's a turkey oak going up, and there is literally a pine wrapped around the tree, spiraling around it. You see that now? That is Quercus pinus. And being the curious scientist I am, I was like, is this a real thing, or are they just having fun with it? And so I did some analyses. So I took the point pattern that we have from the stem map, and I applied a pair correlation function that looks at the density between, in this case, the small pine on the left and then a big oak. And it says, is the density of that pine more or less dense than we expect by random chance? And it used a permutation to create a 95% confidence interval. That's the gray band there. The black line is the actual observed values in the forest. And so anything above that gray confidence band suggests that it's more dense than we expect by random chance. Anything less than that gray band would be less dense than we expect by chance. So in this case, Quercus pinus was a real thing. It deserved its name. We found within 5 meters of a focal oak tree, we were much more likely to find a pine than we would have expected by random chance. If we look at all of the other combinations, so I do pine to pine on the top, Yeah, pine to pine on the top, oak to pine, and then oak to oak. We can see nothing really likes to grow near the pines. That's what we're seeing in panels A and B, that they're less dense than expected. But then in the bottom, we see that the oaks are more dense. They're clustering around the other oak trees. Now, this could be for a number of reasons. We didn't start saying, oh, we have a quercus quercus. This oak species is also clonal, so it will sprout from the roots. There's good reasons why we might find more there. But we wanted to dig into this, so this was odd to us that we would have a pine benefiting from an oak. A lot of the literature in pine-oak interactions, because there's forests all over the world that contain pine and oak, it's often the other way, that the oak is attracted to the pine. And so we're curious. And we also have this situation where we're dealing with a very strange species. I don't know if you know much about Pinus palustris or longleaf pine, but it has very strange life stages. Very distinct. So it starts out like most trees as a little seedling, and then it will live for about a year as a few needles sticking up out of the ground, and then it turns into a grass stage. And so this thing looks like a bunch grass for 2 to 7 years. It's just hanging out in the understory, and it looks like a grass. Then all of a sudden, for reasons not quite well known, it shoots up. It goes into this bolt phase, or sometimes people call it a rocket phase. We've measured the stem elongation of over a ½ meter regularly and almost to a meter in some years per year growth. This is an accelerated growth phase where it leaves the bunch grass phase and shoots for the sky. And then it gets up into a sapling stage, and then finally it attains what we would consider to be kind of an adult and canopy tree on the landscape. So it has very distinct life stages. So we're able to look at those life stages, and I convinced an ambitious grad student that we should go out and we should map all of the longleaf pine, not just what's a centimeter, but everything under a centimeter down to that grass stage across a large section of the forest. So this is the black box in the inside is a 9-hectare chunk of this forest. The map I'm showing you is color-coded by pine dominance in reds and oak dominance in blues. So I took a 15-meter neighborhood and I calculated what the dominance was for every meter squared of my plot. And so I have a surface here that talks about who is the dominant species in this area. And I said, let's go out and map these seedlings, and let's look to see what the recruitment rate and the seedling layer looks like around these oak pine areas. Are you ready? I'm going to show you this stem map. That's where the pine seedlings are. I don't know. I looked at this and was like, I don't even need statistics to say the pines are growing in the blue parts, and they're not really growing in the red parts. But of course, we need statistics. So we modeled this. And we looked at recruitment, and we said, what's the relationship between the neighborhood composition, so that NCI value, and the seedling density as small seedlings, or grass stage, or bolt stage? What we found is, agreeing with our Quercus pinus, nothing really likes to grow near the seedlings of longleaf pine don't like to grow in dense areas of longleaf pine. But what we did find in the grass stage and the recruit stage, we found greater recruitment under denser areas of oak, right? So that's kind of counterintuitive if this is a competition issue, right? Like more seedlings growing in denser areas of oak was surprising to us. The last one here is canopy cover. So we were asking, is this just about light? And slightly positive benefit of having greater canopy cover for the grass stage. But the other two were non-significant. All right, so that's one part of demography. This is the recruitment. But what about growth? Same sort of idea here. We have our neighborhood competition index on the x-axis, and then or cover index, and then the growth of the different life stages. So the top's the grass stage, the bottom's the bolt stage. What we found that is intriguing to me is that this top middle panel shows that oaks, as the oak density went up, growth, this is volumetric growth of these seedlings in this grass stage, was higher, right? So we're getting greater growth and greater density of oaks. The grass stage growth went down in greater canopy cover, which was also interesting. But this positive effect of being around an oak to your growth as a seedling or grass stage is very intriguing to us. We went on to look also at survival. So we looked at the growth, the survival, which is on the y-axis here, modeled by oak density and pine density. We found that, again, probability of survival went up under higher densities of oaks, but went way down for higher densities of pine. We're in the process of examining what the actual, because this is all patterns, right? So we don't have a mechanism here. We don't know why this is happening, but we're in the process of trying to disentangle these things with a series of experiments. But the long-term outcome of this positive effect could be, if you roll this out through time, is potentially the exclusion of oak species on the landscape. One thing that I didn't really mention is this is a fire-prone system. This is an oak pine savanna, and so we think the probably major driver of this positive effect is differences in fire behavior between the oak and pine dominated regions. But that leads me to species coexistence, right? Is this just going to turn over to a one species system? And the effects neighbors can have on the ability to coexist with each other is something that's intrigued ecologists and people in this room for a while. Some of the people in this room have been studying this a good while, beyond myself. So the species-specific interactions could have strong implications. And this was described way back over 50 years ago in the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, talking about the density dependence or distance dependence of individuals and how that might relate to species coexistence. So if you're not familiar with this, Jansen and Connell kind of independently suggested that every tree has a seed rain that has some declining value with distance. And they proposed, if there are species-specific pests and pathogens that want to eat that individual, that they're probably going to focus in close by to the adult, and your probability of regeneration of being successful goes up as you get further away, which results in this zone of probable establishment, right? So it predicts that we should find the most individuals at some intermediate distance away from adults. So from a top-down view, you might have a parent tree. It has some seed shadow where it's dense in the middle and then declines away from it. But there's a natural enemy that wants to come in and eat that individual, the seedlings or the seeds. And then you get this zone of probable recruitment a little further out where you get enough seeds, but the enemy is not as present. And then you get a low-density seedling zone. But if we look at this on the landscape, we're going to have patches of trees across the forest, and those might overlap and maybe interact. And the neighborhood pressure on individuals might be really important. So if we look at this again at the community level, so if we have these zones, if we have recruitment in this green area of that species, so this is a species with a blue top and a blue, or a green top and a blue outline, if those die, we'd expect them to be replaced by other things. So that's how species coexistence could be maintained by this hypothesis that there's species-specific things looking for you, is that you would get spatial mixing through time, and the success of individuals really dictates that. So I started to do a bit of a review going into this, thinking about like, what's the literature shown us? And I was overwhelmed. If you've ever dug into this literature, there's a vast amount of information. So to measure these effects though, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So the diversity of forests requires a simplifying assumption. So we do this a lot where we code things as conspecific neighbors, so the same species, or heterospecific neighbors. That's going to be important through the rest of this talk. In this equation from Canham, sorry, this term here, the S term, allows us to look at, we can use that to split out species by either conspecific or heterospecific neighbors. I don't know if that's, there we go. Okay. There we go. So in that review, I was like, there's just too much literature now, but conveniently there was a meta-analysis done a few years ago that suggests that the effects of conspecifics tend to be negative across the board for temperate tropical sites. Both distance and density tend to have a negative effect. So the more conspecifics you have in your neighborhood, the worse you do as a seedling and survival. This tends to hold for most all the other life stages. And indeed, a recent analysis from last year looked at 23 of those forest geosites, and they found that 22 of those 23 sites had enough conspecific density dependence to stabilize coexistence at that forest. So this suggests that we've got a pattern across the world that is a mechanism for maintaining species diversity. But these neighborhoods, these forests are long-lived, right? They develop over a long time. And so we're capturing snapshots, 5-year intervals of what's happening in these neighborhoods. I'm going to show you a neighborhood develop over a really long time. So colleagues of mine up at Harvard Forest have been doing a neighborhood where they actually core the trees. They core all the trees in a neighborhood, and they looked at it. I'm going to show you a eastern hemlock forest in Pennsylvania developed through time. So notice the year up at the top. That's based on the tree ring data they collected. So if you keep your eye on that upper left part, you see a tree that's bigger than all the rest. That tree was the first to, the oldest one established. That's actually the oldest eastern hemlock known in the United States. It's over 600 years old. It's developing through time and with its neighbors, right? We've got a history of each of these individuals. These circles are actually scaled to the diameter of the tree. So this is a true to scale animation. But that one big tree there on the upper left is started back in 1360s something. Let me see, 1365. So this is the final map. The dates are the year the tree established, or the oldest ring that they looked at. These trees are hundreds of years old, have been coexisting for hundreds of years. Most of these it's a hemlock forest. If you don't know eastern hemlock, it's a conifer that is well known to be very tolerant of shade. Notice there are gaps though there too, right? There's areas where there aren't trees and there aren't neighbors. This is what that forest actually looks like. That 657-year-old tree, that's the oldest hemlock known in the US. Those are the ages of the other trees around it. These have been neighbors for centuries. And they've gone through a lot of stuff together. They cored all of these trees and they were able to, build this chronology of the dynamics through time. But I'm going to look at that one individual tree and its actual growth rate. So the red line is the actual growth rate based on tree rings. And then the gray line is a smooth fit that I put on there to give you a sense of just what like a smooth fit over time would have looked like. And these areas of departure, where it goes above or below that line, are periods of suppression or release. So you can see that about year 1600, just prior to that, there was a large area of release where the tree grew a whole lot, right? So it conceivably was released from competition. A neighbor died. My point here is that we've been looking at all the stuff I've talked to you about so far has been about living trees and who's your living neighbor. But these trees have been existing for centuries and had lots of neighbors through time. And that's going to bring me to my ghost story. So in this one, I'm going to turn towards Wabacan plot in the Forest Geo Network. This is a 25-hectare plot in northern Wisconsin. It's a mixed hardwood conifer forest. And we're going to use that plot to ask, what happens after a neighbor dies? What does that mean to the survival of trees? And this was a question I'd been wanting to ask for a long time, right? If we have this focal tree approach and classically, we would expect that if a tree dies nearby, then your neighbor is gone, and now you have resources, right? You're released from competition. You should survive better, you should grow better. And if these Jansen-Connell dynamics matter, it's probably going to play out most readily in these gap sort of situations. Who gets the gap? Who wins that species spot? And so I wanted to look at this, and so we ventured out and we tried this. Like I just said, most of this has taken place on living trees, but we took 3 censuses of data, and we said, okay, everything living at the beginning is our current neighborhood. And then we went to time 2 and said, okay, now we have living and dead neighbors. And then we can look at survival to time 3. What we found, and these are model parameter results, so it's good to be bigger. That's what the DBH means, right? So that positive effects means your survival was better if you were larger. We also looked at conspecific density and heterospecific density. Those are the next 2. Those were non-significant. What we found that was most significant and negatively significant, was significant and negative, was the LC dens, and that is the legacy conspecific. So the density of dead conspecifics in your neighborhood had the strongest negative effect. So if a individual of the same species died near you, your probability of survival in the next 5 years went way down. That was pretty surprising, but we've now done preliminary analysis on 14 different forest geoplots around the world. The data's not ready yet to show you, but this suggests that this pattern is nearly ubiquitous across forests. That if you're in a neighborhood where your conspecific dies, that is bad. Now, we could come up with a lot of reasons why that might be, or a couple major ones, right? Is that was killed by a natural enemy, and so now you're food, and it's looking for food. Or the resources there were depleted to an extent that you're now at a competitive disadvantage. Or it's just a bad place to be that species at that time for some reason. This was with big trees. This was with things over 1 centimeter in diameter. If we think about what's happening in that seedling layer, right? When a gap forms and what's going on in the seedling layer, Luke McGee, here pictured here in this photo, went out and asked at 3 different forest geosites, Harvard Forest, Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. He mapped and tracked individual seedlings through time and looked at, are they in a gap or are they in a closed canopy forest? We're also able to age those gaps because all of these sites are neon sites, which have the National Ecological Observatory Network. They have almost annual photography. So we were able to look at gaps and age them. So we were able to look at what's the effect of being in a gap, and what does it matter to how old that gap is, and what does it matter about who made that gap? So what we found overall is that seedling survival was worse if you were in a neighborhood with a living conspecific, and those are in blue, and in a dead conspecific. So being around in a heterospecific gap, your probability of survival was much better, relatively speaking. We did this also across all the species that we looked at. We had enough individuals of 6 different species here across the 3 sites to look at this effect. And for most all species, it was always worse to be around a conspecific when it was living and dead as a seedling. When we take the effect of averaging, so this purple is showing replacing one of your neighbors in the neighborhood with a heterospecific versus a conspecific, we find that indeed this is a negative effect relative to each other. So it's bad to be around a conspecific when it's dying or alive if you're a seedling, relatively speaking to heterospecifics. those persist. So we were able to look at this through time by aging the canopy gaps. We found that across all species, there was it was bad at first, there was a slight release, and then it got worse for some reason. But typically always a negative effect of being around a conspecific through time, and we can do that again for all the species. This paper was actually just published like a week and a half ago, so if you want to go see it, you can check it out. Those conspecific effects are more negative than the heterospecific effects. We found that across the board. And even within species, except for this weird case of Quercus rubra there on the kind of upper right, had, for some reason, the younger gaps had a positive benefit. So maybe there's not, it appears to have gotten a release and benefited from it for some reason. So, we took these results and we simulated them and modeled what that would mean to the stabilizing density dependence. So would this lead to greater diversity or maintain the biodiversity that existed in those forests? What we found was it was highly probable that across all species, this would lead to a greater degree of coexistence, except for that one weird outlier there, that strong V shape is that Quercus rubra. It seemed to have a less of an advantage when it was near conspecifics. This line of research is something that I'm really excited about following. But to wrap things up here and give you time for questions, I'm gonna, so I think examining forest neighborhoods allows us to gain insights into the mechanisms that are driving forest packing on the landscape in these complicated multi-species forests. Those neighborhood interactions provide us great opportunities to test theories, as well as develop new theories and empirical tests to examine dynamics in forests and understand how forests work. These ecological legacies is an emerging area that I'm really excited about that might emerge as an important driver, and we'll need to dig in a little more on the mechanisms that are driving this pattern as we go forward. I really want to thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Larry. Great talk.
Thank you.
2 questions. One, you showed Mr. Rogers, you're talking about ghost stories and acts. Have you talked to any humanists or folks that you can't do ethnographic studies on trees, but to glean insights on social aspects that match this kind of global pattern that you're seeing? And then the second one, for the pine and oak kind of situation, is there any wildlife, view that actually gets the pine right next to an oak? Because you mentioned like the seed fall, and so yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Those are interesting questions. The first one, I have not talked to any humanists about extending my analogies. I'm often reluctant to draw too many parallels between humans and trees, but that's an interesting one. If you have any recommendations of who I should talk to, I'm happy to reach out. For the second part, I wish I had a picture. So we have it's a southern fox squirrel that is giant. These are squirrels that are like this big. They're beautiful. They come in all different colors. They are almost obligate on longleaf pine. They love tearing apart their cones. We've got images of cones just shredded underneath turkey oaks. We think that they grab the cones from the pine and go over to the turkey oak and actually deposit them. But the pine is also wind dispersed. So the seeds are kind of everywhere. And I didn't show the data, but we had a mast year. So longleaf pine is a masting species. They have about every 2 to 7 years, they put out a huge crop of cones. we mapped all those seedlings before the mast year, and then we got the mast year, and there were about 1,200 individuals in the seedling layer that I showed. It went to like, well, my back of the envelope calculation from a few samples was we were looking at somewhere between 40 and 60,000 new recruits in that mast year. So obviously we didn't do that. We didn't go there, but subsequently, almost very few of those actually recruited to the next year. So the seeds are definitely getting around. That initial sample we did showed that they were occurring in both pine and oak dominated areas as germinates, but they did not last under the pines for sure. So yeah, there is an animal interaction, and it's big squirrels, and they're really cool. They're called Sherman fox squirrels if you're interested.
So I had questions about the grass and the bolt stage. Do they spend a fixed amount of time in that stage, or those stages? And do you know, I know that you said you don't know everything, or that they're kind of mysterious, but, and does what happened in those stages, the amount of energy you're able to accrue or something like that, have long-term consequences for anything, disease resistance or growth?
Yeah, good question. So the literature says they stay in the grass stage from 2 to 7 years. Though nobody's done what we've done, is actually track them individually through time that I can tell. So we're actually going to have data fairly soon on how long they actually are staying in that grass stage, because we have the initial recruits, and now we'll be able to track them through time to see how long they stayed in that grass stage. It's not predetermined. It's certainly got something to do with fire, right? So the fire return interval of this area is somewhere on the order of the magnitude of 2 to 7 years. So it was obviously a strategy that got, well, not obviously, probably a strategy that got fixed in the population to deal with frequent fires. And they're most susceptible to fire when they're in that growth stage. When they're in the grass stage, the fire burns up to them, and something about the thermodynamics of the grass, it just keeps the apical bud protected. I have seen them over and over. They'll burn half the needles off, and then it'll be left. It'll like the fire gave it a haircut, and that was about it. But when they enter that bolt stage, their apical bud is exposed to the flame, and if the flame height is high enough, it will roast that bud, and then it's game over for that individual, because longleaf pine, though it has had a few documented cases of resprouting, doesn't really resprout. We have never seen, at our site, we've never seen any of them that died resprout. So it seems to be very much fire driven, how long they stay in there, and that benefit of just plowing, shooting for the sky to get your apical bud up above the fire seems like a advantageous strategy that would get fixed.
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels to that in other things going on in other understories where you're kind of chugging along, building up your energy, and then something hits and you do a really non-linear 1 or 2 years, and then wait for the next thing. That's
Right,
cool.
right. That gap forming, or, yep.
Hi, Dan. Sorry.
Hey, Mark.
Turkey oak. So you saw it's a very sort of scant and shrubby, small tree.
Yes.
I can't help, I see the same sort of demographic sort of patterns that you see with Kalmia and oak. And I'm just wondering whether there's when you talk about the affinity of pine being associated with the turkey oak, whether there's a nurse phenomena going on or there's a wildlife phenomena in terms of cover. We find at the Yale Forest that Kalmia actually probably, we haven't got the same kind of great data that you have, but the data that we do have shows an affinity of oak with Kalmia compared to a lot of the other species. And we can potentially relate that to the fact that there's an animal interaction, deer browse, for example. Oak is very prone to deer browse. There's also a certain degree of cover that promotes the oak and its vigorous sort of stem structure compared to sort of a whippy species like birch. So what about sort of just the habitat differences, this patchiness of habitat as a influencing phenomena? And you mentioned light, there's a sort of a weak affinity there. What about soil moisture?
So remind me if I forget one of your questions, but I'll start with the end because that was one of our hypotheses why we were seeing this beneficial effect was, well, maybe there's just more soil moisture. I didn't mention this, but the soil types at this site are sand and deeper sand. It's Florida. This is old sand dunes. It's really poor soil and it's very well drained. And so water does not stick around in these soils very long. And so we were like, okay, there's some idea that there's hydraulic lift. So plants will bring up water during the day, at night they relax and it seeps out their leaky roots and the soil gets wetted. And we were like, well, maybe there's just more water under the oaks than there are under the pines, and that's making...
No, I'm making the other argument. So this is another sort of study. By holding on to reserve trees within a forest dominated by a reserve oak, you're promoting a more droughty environment underneath the oak through root competition, which in turn promotes more drought-endurant species as compared to the more mesic species.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So we put out soil moisture sensors under oaks and pines and found it is actually wetter under the pines than it is under the oaks. So the pines are doing more hydraulic lift potentially than the oaks. So it is potentially drier under the oaks. So maybe that supports your hypothesis. And longleaf pine is the thought is while it's in that grass stage, it's putting all its resources into a taproot. It's going down to get to water. So in that process, it has to be pretty drought tolerant to get down there. So that's an interesting hypothesis. What were your other questions, Mark? I don't remember. Okay. Well, if you remember, reach out. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Dan, I have a question,
Yes.
which is, have you tried for the legacy effects? Obviously, like the main issue is teasing apart whether it's just a bad site for that species, so there's been a lot of conspecifics that died there, versus the conspecifics have that like actual direct negative legacy effect. And like, have you tried looking at like not just the number, but like the proportion or some way to tease apart whether it's not just that you have more that died, but like controlling for the mortality rate of a site? And I haven't yet worked out how exactly to do that, but I'm just curious if there were various ways that you looked at that or quantified that to try and figure it out, or if it's just something that has to be done experimentally.
Yeah, we haven't. Joe Wright required us to tear apart the neighborhood variable in every single way we possibly could, and it was very robust. But we haven't done that sort of look, and I'd love to talk to you more about what that might look like. Luke McGee, whose work was featured prominently in this, he got a postdoc with Andy Jones to do some experimental work looking at if there are mechanisms that are driving this and what they might be. So there's some work being done kind of on that side, but actually tearing apart how we're quantifying what the negative contribution is and how that might point towards a process would be interesting. Yeah, but we haven't done that, no.
We have time for one quick question.
It's going to be super quick. Do you have any idea of the water potential of those trees, the oaks and the pines, if they're doing different things? Because I'm wondering, like, are they just like, you know, like what are the stomata doing if they're closing early or later? I'm just like wondering, like, it's great that you guys looked into the hydraulic lift, and the soil moisture, but yeah, just water potential in general. That's
Yeah.
gonna be my question.
So Bill Hammond's student was the one that put out the soil moisture sensors and has been doing some work out there. I think they did pre-dawn and midday water potentials, but I haven't seen those data yet. But yeah, Bill's thinking about this too, so you know he's going to go out there and measure that stuff. Thank you all again.
Yes.
I really
Join me
appreciate
in
it.
thanking Dan once more. There is a class coming in, so